2020 sucked for, well, let's be honest, just about everybody, and sports fans are certainly no exception to that. But it was not the worst year in the history of sports. Okay, sure, I'll grant you that 2020 was probably one of, if not the worst years for the sports community as a whole. But every sports fan has their favorite team, and there certainly are years for just about every team that most fans would almost rather that team didn't play for. I mean, just ask Cleveland Browns or Detroit Lions fans. But fortunately, most of us are fans of more than one team across sports, so even if your favorite team does have one of those years that you would rather forget happened, one of those other teams you cheer for can still step up to fill that void. But every now and then, that perfect storm comes together to make a season that's worse than having no sports at all. And that's where the 2008 year of Seattle sports comes in, the worst year of sports any city has ever seen. And when it comes to painful Seattle sports, especially over the last couple of decades, then where better to start than with the Mariners? Now, as we know, at least at the time which I'm making this video, the Mariners are still in the middle of a 20, potentially 20 plus year playoff drought, which for most of that time has seen them be mostly mediocre to bad. But things weren't always that way, especially towards the beginning. And the Mariners of 2008 were coming off of an 88-win season that saw them finish in a tie for second place in the wildcard race, which in today's MLB would at least get them into a play-in game for one of the two wildcard spots. But since in the early 2000s it was still a one wildcard system in the MLB, that meant that the 2007 Mariners were out of the playoffs, which was something they were fairly used to, as the same had been true in 2002 and 2003. So coming into the 2008 season, the Mariners weren't necessarily World Series favorites, but they were coming off of a pretty strong 2007 campaign and did have pretty much the entirety of the lineup that had hit for the third best average in the major leagues the year before. So there was definitely some hope that they could run it back and make the playoffs, and once you're there, who knows, maybe they could make a run. Unfortunately, however, again missing only Jose Guillen from that 2007 lineup, the Mariners' team batting average would drop 22 points in the 2008 season, going from third best in baseball to 13th. And this was largely due to a couple of players in particular whose batting averages dropped significantly. Now, Ichiro was still hitting over 300 at 310, but was coming off of a 2007 season where he had been hitting 351. But Ichiro wasn't the only one to have a major slip in batting average, as both Kenji Jojima and Jose Vidro also had pretty abysmal 2008 seasons compared to what they were able to do the year before. Really, the only batter in the lineup who had significant improvement was Jose Lopez. And I know batting average doesn't necessarily capture the full picture, but even when you look at team OPS, well, things look just as bad, if not worse there, where the team OPS dropped from a 2007 mark of 762 all the way to a tied for fourth worst in baseball 707 in 2008. Meanwhile, on the pitching side, there was a little bit more turnover, but for good reason, as the downfall of the 2007 team was largely the back end of the rotation and middle relief. So the turnover here was very much to try to fix those problems. In the pen, closer JJ Putz, who had been lights out in 2007, made his return, as well as Sean Green, who were two of the best three arms that they had in 2007, as well as Ryan Rowland-Smith and Mark Lowe, both coming and playing more significant roles in 2008 and doing fairly well in them. Unfortunately, Green's ERA would go up almost an entire point, but much worse than that was JJ Putz, whose ERA more than doubled from 2007 to 2008, going up from a 1.38 the previous season to a 3.88 in the 2008 season. Really, one of the only bright spots or silver linings of that 2008 pen was the fact that Ryan Rowland-Smith again pitched pretty well with a more expanded role, which is also probably a large part of the reason that he is still with the team today as part of their broadcast crew, where he does a fantastic job, so at least they got that out of it. But we're not here to talk about the good things, which is a good thing because as we now get to the starting rotation, This is where the worst of the 2008 season comes into play, with probably what this season is most remembered for by Mariners fans. Now, they did have their three best arms from the previous year coming back in Jared Washburn, Miguel Batista, and a young Felix Hernandez. But again, even here, things did not go as planned in 2008, as Miguel Batista in particular struggled mightily and ended up splitting time between the starting rotation and bullpen by the end of the season. Meanwhile, Carlos Silva, who joined the team, was also pretty terrible, and Washburn was only kind of okay. Felix did pitch again pretty well for a young pitcher and continued to look like a strong piece of the team's future. But it was the last part of this rotation that is really the focus here. And honestly, it doesn't even have anything to do with his performance, because at least by the numbers, when he was healthy anyway, he was the second best pitcher in the Mariners starting rotation in 2008. Plus, when Eric Bedard joined the team, he did bring some hope to the fan base because it seemed like they were trying to address the weaknesses of the 2007 team to make a run in 2008. The problem here, though, is what the Mariners gave up to acquire Bedard from the Orioles, as this is very likely the worst trade in Mariners history, and that is certainly saying something. Now, again, Bedard was a decent pickup for the Mariners, but even at the time, this trade looked like it was going to be pretty lopsided in the other direction, and that's even before Bedard kind of flamed out in Seattle. I'm not going to get too deep into the trade because honestly, this one probably deserves a video of its own. But in return for Bedard, the Orioles got 5 players, including a key piece of the 2007 M's pen in George Sherrill, as well as prospects Chris Tillman, who would end up pitching 10 seasons in Baltimore, including one All-Star appearance, and another prospect by the name of Adam Jones. And again, Bedard did pitch decently well for the Mariners when he was available to. The problem being he was not always available, as he constantly battled injuries, only pitching 15 games in each of the 2 full seasons he spent in Seattle. And as far as the 2008 team as a whole is concerned, again, after having added pieces to an 88-win 2007 team, the 2008 Mariners went on to win 61 games, losing 101, the worst record the franchise had seen in 25 years. Now, of course, winning 27 fewer games is usually not what you're looking for after having added to a team, but losing as many games as the Mariners did does come with one upside, and that is the fact that you usually get a pretty good draft pick. In fact, 100 losses does pretty frequently earn you the top pick. And coming into the last 3 games of the 2008 season, the Mariners all but had the first pick locked up. All they had to do was lose one of their games against the A's, or have the Nationals win one of their 3 against the Phillies to finish out the season. Unfortunately, the Phillies would go ahead and sweep the Nationals, which wasn't a terrible surprise as they would end up winning the division, but the Mariners would go on to sweep the A's, which wasn't something that they had done very much up till that point in the season, but it did mean that they would lose the first overall pick to the Nationals. And with that first overall pick, the Nationals would pick up pitcher Steven Strasburg. Meanwhile, the Mariners got Dustin Ackley. Though, to be fair, hindsight is 2020 and all that, and even if Strasburg was probably the best pick that the Mariners could have had they not swept the A's in the final series, Dustin Ackley at the time still did seem like a pretty decent pick that could turn into a really good player down the road. But since we do have the luxury of hindsight now, we can look at this draft and rub even more salt into the wound, because with the 25th pick, the Angels selected Mike Trout. So it is pretty clear that even with Ichiro, Felix, and Adrian Beltre all on the roster, the 2008 Mariners season was a particularly miserable one. But again, one team having a miserable season doesn't make it the worst year in all of sports. Fortunately for Seattle, while the Mariners have been largely incompetent over the last 2 decades, the other major team in the city, in the Seahawks, has been pretty much the exact opposite. By now, we're all pretty familiar with the successes of the Russell Wilson era, even outside of some of the issues they've had in the playoffs over the last few years, but still, none of that even started until 2012. Still though, in 2008, the Hawks were coming off of a 10-6 record in 2007, which was coming at the end of 5 consecutive playoff appearances and 4 consecutive division titles. Plus, they were just a couple of years removed from the franchise's first Super Bowl appearance, which is a whole nother issue, but again, we're not going to get into that. Even with all that having been said though, coming into the 2008 season, fans did know that change was on the horizon and coming quickly. Shaun Alexander had just been released after a lackluster 2007, Matt Hasselbeck was a few years into his 30s and clearly on the downhill from his prime, and longtime Seahawks head coach Mike Holmgren had announced that 2008 would be his last year as the head coach. Also, place kicker Josh Brown left in free agency chasing money, but no one in Seattle missed him very much. But even with that knowledge that the Hasselbeck-Holmgren era was coming to an end, nobody expected what 2008 would end up turning into. They would open the season getting blown out 34-10 by a Bills team that would end up finishing last in their division, and then coming home and narrowly losing to the 49ers in the home opener to fall to 0-2, but would bounce back, absolutely beating the crap out of a terrible Rams team, winning 37-14 and getting their record to 1-2 before an unenviable Week 4 bye. And then coming out of their bye week in Week 5, the Hawks would end up having their worst loss of the season, falling 44-6 to the New York Giants, and worst of all, losing Matt Hasselbeck to a knee injury. And by the time he returned in Week 11, the Seahawks had only won one more game, now with a record of 2-8. For Hasselbeck, he would only end up playing 3 more games that season before falling to another injury, and the Seahawks would lose all 3 of those, eventually breaking a 6-game losing streak with back-to-back wins in weeks 15 and 16 of the season, though those would be their last ones as they would finish the season with a record of 4-12. It's a record that saw 2008 become the worst season the franchise had seen since 1992, and is still tied for the 3rd worst season in franchise history. As for Hasselbeck, this was easily the worst year of his career as a starter, playing in just 7 games after having never started fewer than 12 since coming to Seattle in 2001, and he would still play 14 or more games in the remaining 3 seasons of his career as a starter. But it wasn't just the offense with Hasselbeck's injury issues that would cause the 2008 Seahawks to struggle though, as on the defensive side of the ball, a team which had been 7th best in points per game in the NFL the previous season, giving up just 18.2 points per game that year, would add over 6 points per game to that total in 2008, which would end up being good for 25th in the NFL, and for yards per game, they would be all the way down at 30th. But again, having a season as bad as the Seahawks did in 2008 does come with that silver lining of having a particularly high draft pick, which, when it comes to the Seahawks, they're not particularly used to having a pick in the top 5, really in the history of the franchise. So what did they end up doing with that 4th overall pick in the 2009 draft? No, they didn't end up trading it down. That's really not something they would start doing frequently until later on. Though, honestly, with this draft, they probably wish they had, because with the 4th overall pick, they ended up picking Aaron Curry, who is now widely regarded as the worst draft pick in the history of the franchise. So obviously, even with this not being a particularly strong draft class looking back at it, there still are a number of better picks that the Seahawks could have made here that still went later on in the draft. But even just assuming that they really wanted a linebacker where Curry played, later on in the draft, they could have still taken Brian Arakpo, Brian Cushing, or Clay Matthews, who all went later in the first round. So in 2008, both the Seahawks and Mariners had one of the worst years in franchise history, respectively, and got basically nothing for it in return. But that's okay. For a lot of people, pro sports aren't everything. I mean, for example, there's still college football, and in Seattle, that likely means you're either a fan of the Washington Huskies or the Washington State Cougars on the other side of the state. So, there's still a couple of teams to look at. The Huskies are the one that plays in the Seattle area, so let's start there. Now, right off the bat, it is fair to mention that not a lot was expected of the 2008 Huskies. They were coming off of a 4-9 season in 2007. but still, their young sophomore QB in Jake Locker had looked pretty good in his freshman season in 2007, so with some progress in 2008, there was a chance that they could maybe sneak into a bowl game. But things definitely did not get off to a particularly good start for the Dogs, as they would open things up getting blown out 44-10 by the rival Oregon Ducks, then losing a close 1-point game to BYU before getting absolutely demolished by Oklahoma 55-14, falling to 0-3 leading into a Week 4 matchup with Stanford. And it was a beatable Stanford Cardinal team as well. Unfortunately for the Huskies, though, they would lose Locker to a broken thumb that would end up knocking him out for the rest of the season in the first half, and end up falling to the Cardinal 35-28 and falling to 0-4. And without Locker, things would not go particularly well, as they would end up losing the next 6 games by a combined score of 60-237, giving them an 0-10 record leading into a rivalry weekend where they would play those Wazoo Cougars. But in spite of how the rest of the Huskies season had gone, and still being without their starting quarterback, it did end up being a pretty close Apple Cup game, ending up in double overtime, though the Cougars would end up winning by a field goal, dropping the Huskies to 0-11, which they would end up making 0-12 with a 48-7 loss to Cal the following week. As far as the 2008 Cougars are concerned on the other side of the state, well, at the risk of upsetting Wazoo fans, I think it's somewhat safe to say that the Cougars are usually not the better of the two teams within Washington. But with that having been said, as far as 2008 is concerned, you can't be worse than winless. Plus, as we know, the Cougars did hand the Huskies one of those 12 losses. Unfortunately for the Cougars, though, while they did have the best record in the state by virtue of having actually won a game, it wasn't by a whole lot, as they would end up finishing the season just 2-11, having beaten those winless Huskies and the best team in all of Portland, Oregon in Portland State. And like the Huskies, it wasn't a particularly competitive season for the Cougars either, as they had a pretty embarrassing 7-game stretch of their own between those two wins, where they would end up losing all 7 games by a total score of 58-374. Which included back-to-back losses, one to Pete Carroll's Trojans 69-0, which seems almost too perfect to be true, and then the next week 58-0 to Stanford. To be fair, beyond football, there's still men's basketball at the collegiate level that even in Washington draws a decent amount of attention, and with both Wazoo and UW, they flip-flopped places in the 2 years that 2008 was a part of, between below average and pretty good seasons. And of course, there's the best men's basketball team in the state in Gonzaga, who had 2 pretty dominant regular seasons, again with the 2 that 2008 was a part of. But when it came to the 2008 NCAA tournament, they were upset in the first round by a 10 seed. So things still didn't go particularly well, even for a team that, again, dominated like they usually do in the regular season. And for you diehard Seattle sports fans out there, yes, I know there are other teams that call Seattle or the state of Washington home as well that plenty of people cheer for. I mean, the Sounders didn't join the MLS until 2009, but there still was a fair amount of excitement about them being an expansion team for the MLS the following year. And as far as the WNBA's Storm, the 2008 season was, at least to that point in their existence, the best regular season the team had seen, with a 22-12 record, although they would be upset in the first round of the WNBA playoffs. As far as hockey is concerned, obviously it would still be another decade before the NHL would even announce that they were sending an expansion team to Seattle, but there still are 4 WHL teams that call the state of Washington home that have decent fan bases. And all 4 of them did have decent years, but it was definitely the Spokane Chiefs that had the best year of all, as they did end up winning the WHL championship in 2008. At the NHL level at the time, most people in Seattle were Vancouver Canucks fans, but the Canucks in 2008 had their worst season in a decade span between 2002 and 2012, so yeah, there's not a whole lot of hope there either. But even with all of that, while I acknowledge that some of those smaller teams of smaller leagues did manage to have some success in 2008, Still, it was a very miserable year for Seattle sports, or Washington State sports as a whole, considering, again, both the Seahawks and Mariners had some of their worst years in franchise history, while the two big college football teams in the state combined for just 2 wins. And that isn't even the worst part of 2008 for Seattle sports, not by a long shot. And that's because when the year started, there was still one more major team that called Seattle home, that being the NBA's Seattle Supersonics. The 07-08 Sonics were coming off of a terrible 31-51 season the year before, though to be fair, they did manage to use that to pick up future star Kevin Durant. But then in the 07-08 season, even with a rookie Durant, they would only manage to win 20 games, losing 62. But even that worst record in the 41-year history of the franchise is little more than a footnote in the tragedy that was the Sonics in 2008, as it really was a purposeful creation of the ownership group that had been hell-bent on moving the team to Oklahoma City since buying them in 2006. By 2008, most of the damage had been done. Starbucks overlord Howard Schultz had already stabbed the knife into the back of Seattle and kindly invited a group of snakes from Oklahoma, led by Clay Bennett, to twist it over the next couple of years. It was a carefully crafted multi-year campaign fueled by lies that Bennett rarely even bothered to pretend were anything but. It included one of the worst stadium proposals that anyone has ever seen, so clearly never meant to be taken seriously that it's honestly kind of embarrassing, as well as 2 years of alienating the team from the fan base by pretty much keeping the players entirely away from the public as well as local media as much as possible, in an effort to prevent any fans from really developing an attachment to any of the players on the team or the team itself. Bennett didn't do it all on his own though. He did have help in his theft of the Sonics from both city and state government, many of whom were more interested in petty politics than actually doing what was right for the community by trying to save the team. Now, to be fair, in 2008, then Seattle Mayor Greg Nichols did step in at the last minute to try to save the team by holding the ownership group to the lease that the team had with Key Arena. But in the end, he would end up caving with a settlement rather than seeing the outcome of the trial that could have very well kept the team in Seattle for at least 2 more years. And with the recession that came in 2008 that ended up taking a large chunk of the money from the financiers that were backing this Oklahoma group, probably could have kept the Sonics in Seattle indefinitely. There were other real attempts to save the team as well, but those also ended up getting shot down by many of those same city and state governments that we talked about before. So finally, in July of 2008, Clay Bennett, with the love and support of his dear friend David Stern, who also happened to be the NBA commissioner at the time, ended up getting what he wanted and moved the team to Oklahoma City. Stole the team and took them to Oklahoma City. 12 years later, Howard Schultz did finally apologize for his role in the Sonics leaving Seattle, while trying to drum up support for his run at president. Seattle remembered what he had done and told him to f*** off, however, much like what he did with the Sonics. And as far as Kevin Durant, even with some of his admitted flaws, for the most part he is still loved in Seattle, especially after leaving Oklahoma City the way that he did. All in all then, 2008 was nothing short of sports hell in the city of Seattle and really Washington State as a whole, in a way that had really never been seen before and hasn't really been seen since. Of course, if you think you can beat that, feel free to let me know down in the comments section. I would love to see what you've got. Fortunately for Seattle sports fans, things have gotten better in the 12 years since. The Mariners still have yet to make the playoffs since 2008, but still have only had one other season that was anywhere near as bad. The Seahawks, of course, have been one of the best teams in football and brought a championship back to the city. And now we have an NHL team on its way. A team whose existence built the arena that could even very well bring the Sonics back to Seattle in the years to come. But with that, we have reached the end of this one. If you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. And for your sake, unless maybe you're from Oklahoma City, I genuinely hope that you never have to go through what Seattle sports fans did in 2008. And until next time, stay safe out there and be good to each other.